Hello, welcome to Beyond the Filter. I am your host, Liz Ryerson. This is a podcast about digital media, new media, etc., etc. My guest is Jes Skolnik, and you are the editor of the Bandcamp Daily, correct?
I'm the managing editor.
Managing editor.
There are a bunch of different editors on our team.
Cool. So why don't you talk a little bit about what you do and just give a little background in how you got into music writing and all that kind of stuff.
Okay. I am one quarter of our editorial team. We also have a social media person and a designer, so really 1/6. But there are four of us editors. And our job is to solicit and accept pitches on artists on Bandcamp for review and feature. And I love doing it very, very, very much. We get to cover a really wide range of stuff, and we really kind of get to highlight artists that aren't getting a lot of coverage from other places. It's really written for the Bandcamp audience, who are both fans and artists, which is a kind of unique perspective in music writing, so that's also really cool to me.
You wrote for Pitchfork and some other more sort of typical publications before that.
Yeah, just as a freelancer. I wrote for Pitchfork and Spin and where else? All over the place. But I've also had, some personal essays published in BuzzFeed and other places around. The other half of my life is being an activist and writing about that part of my world. So those are like more personal political essays.
So how did you get started writing about music? What got you interested in it? And how did you come into contact with Bandcamp?
So this is a very long story. It's a lifelong story. My parents are musicians. I grew up in a musical household. My dad fixed amps. He had an amp repair business and did sound for local shows in the DC area when I was growing up. And when I was young, he was also an electrical engineer for the Navy, like as a day job. And my mom's a librarian. So you can kind of see where the interest in music and writing is there, like very, very early. My parents are lovely, and I definitely did not fall far from the tree in that regard. But I started going to shows really early because they supported me in doing that and would take me to the record store with them and really kind of guided my ability to explore music that was on the fringes. I never felt like I fit in anywhere, and kind of getting into punk was the first place where I felt like I might possibly be understood. So I started writing zines from there and contributing to other people's zines. So I was very heavily involved in punk and hardcore zine world for a very long time. I had a column in Maximum Rock and Roll and wrote for a whole bunch of different print zines, wrote for some alt weeklies, and from kind of took some time off from music writing to go to grad school, which I ended up dropping out of, and worked for a labor union for almost 9 years, then got laid off from the labor union, and I had been freelancing sort of now and again while I was working there. And that layoff was sort of the point where I was like, you know what, maybe I should do this full time again. So I started doing it full time again. And Bandcamp Daily, my boss and editor-in-chief, Joe Keys, who's amazing, he's the best boss I've ever had in my life and probably will ever have, approached me at the end of 2015. I was doing a really terrible office clerical job that I really hated and freelancing full time on top of that. And he approached me to be part of the team, submitted my resume along with a whole bunch of other people, and I was one of the people who got picked to get to do it, which is a dream. It's a dream.
It's the Bandcamp writing is Do you know what sort of got them interested in doing articles and stuff? Because Bandcamp is obviously mostly a platform for
Right.
musicians to sell their stuff. I've sold my stuff off Bandcamp, as have many people. So do you know what got them interested in trying to hire more writers?
I don't know specifically the steps that people took or the discussions that were had, but I know that it comes from a desire to, where other streaming platforms sort of depend on playlisting and algorithms in specific to build those playlists. This is more driven by the desire to have sort of humans comb through the site, talk to musicians, to have like the real human element of music discovery there. Learn about artists from people who are as in love with music as you are. That was the mission statement that I was initially approached with, and that's how we've gone forward too. It's just been core to how we operate. It's just writing for people who are dorks about music like we are.
One of the interesting things that I think about Bandcamp is because it's a platform, you see a lot of different kinds of music uploaded there that you wouldn't, obviously see get covered anywhere. And like, I know one thing that was a big trend on Bandcamp, and it's kind of close to me too, as a person who's composed for games, is that people would sell either like chiptune or video game soundtracks. And they would like blow up the charts on Bandcamp.
Yeah, that
like,
stuff's still huge.
and that's a sort of community, like game composing in particular. Chiptune has sort of more of its own community, although it's still like that stuff is kind of relegated to the side. It's not really covered at all by music publications. It's kind of like, people turn up their nose to it, which is very strange to me, honestly. As somebody
Yeah, it's
who's
weird. I feel like a lot of I didn't mean to interrupt. I'm sorry.
No, go ahead.
I was just thinking about how like there's this like sort of mainstream music journalism attitude that it's like amateurish, even though it's not at all, and it requires like a great amount of skill to make a good chiptune piece, just as it takes a great amount of skill to write a good, lo-fi pop song or whatever. And it seems weird that like something like bedroom pop gets covered and chiptune doesn't.
Yeah, I mean, I think about this because like when I used to make music for this website called OC Remix, which was like arrangements of video game music. This was back 2003, 2004, 2005. And like some of those people went on to do chiptune or compose for video games. The site still exists, but I find it really funny that people saying it's amateurish, because a lot of those people wanted to be professionals and like had like these really fancy setups. Like I never had a fancy setup, but like
Totally.
a lot of these people had like incredibly fancy setups. So like the idea that this is like some people like plinking away or whatever. I think it's not that it's like amateurish as much as it's just not cool. Like it's not part of the image that the music world, which is very much based around scenes and like being at the right place at the right time and knowing the right people, that whole like freaking what's that Cameron Crowe movie, Almost Famous, like that kind of stuff. And something like chiptune just is fundamentally like in opposition to that. So it's kind of like it's almost like a threat in a weird way. So it's like kind of I don't know, that's how I see it anyway.
Yeah, which is funny because I mean we just ran a story not long ago on Colectivo Chipotle, the Mexican chiptune collective. And I thought it was a really lovely, warm story about people being really into certain kind of niche music and building their own community around it. And like, that is such a universal story. It's the story of punk scenes. It's the story, it's the story of any outsider scene community. And it was, really lovely story. And it didn't make any sense to me that mainstream publications wouldn't cover something like that.
Yeah. It's my frustration too in knowing that like I am somebody who considers myself more a musician than anything else. Maybe like I'm very interested in like game design and stuff too, but I think I identify more as a musician, and music is like the strongest part of my life. But I never really separated things that I was interested in from each other. Like I never thought that like one culture was inherently in opposition to another culture. And I think especially when I started to, like I went to college and I didn't follow game stuff as much. I started trying to do like a lo-fi pop thing that didn't go anywhere. And like I transitioned and like went through a lot of stuff. I got involved with composing for video games, partly because I thought that would actually help me connect more to musicians and like music world. And I kind of found out that like, just because people care about you in one world doesn't mean that they care about you in the other world. And it seems very much a matter of like framing how you frame yourself online. Like if you're in the wrong community, or if you're in the wrong place and you know the wrong people, then you're disqualified for appearing in other places.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess there's something about that I find just like fundamentally like unfair, and like I think that's part of my frustration. You know, I thought I was like alone with this. Like I didn't really ask people maybe who were interested in game music, who were maybe more successful musicians.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of them wouldn't really know, like, you know, how to like meet people or find the right places. Like it seemed like a landscape that a lot of people were just kind of clueless about. And then I think in the last year, I've become more connected to like people on the offshoot of like the vaporwave community, like or like things like Orange Milk Records, which I had
Mm-hmm.
Keith Rankin on. And I realized that this problem is actually really, really common, and it's getting more and more common as like subgenres that are sort of springing up through the internet form in their own kind of spheres away from, you know, what gets covered and talked about more traditionally in the music press. And it seems like the problem is way bigger than I ever actually thought it was.
Yeah. Yeah. It really, really absolutely is.
I think part of the reason like I want to have more people talking about like and I've done a lot of shows talking about music criticism and stuff is one, I guess, is to try and understand that landscape, but two, I think now that I understand a little bit more, it's just to like make some conversations public that don't actually seem like they're not had publicly. Like
Mm-hmm.
I mean I was talking about this with you earlier, but I don't follow a lot of music podcasts because most of it, and I'm not saying that this is a bad thing or anything, but most of it is like some form of music slash celebrity gossip.
Mm-hmm.
And I just don't see a lot that reflects maybe some of the more kind of underground or, you know, independent, like really independent, not, you know, Arcade Fire independent.
Right.
Um,
Right. Stuff
and
that's really genuinely on the fringes.
yeah, because I don't know. I mean, it seems like even if we're talking about indie rock music, which I think I've said before, that I kind of got in to a lot of stuff through indie rock music, and I wasn't
Mm-hmm.
really into electronic music for a long time until more recently. But it seemed like there were things happening in that world, and then that became the same story that became more commercial in like the 2000s, and like the atmosphere changed and it became more sort of uniform. And like I don't know, growing up sort of I was able, just maybe through my older brother and some other things, doing research online, to find artists who I really liked who were not necessarily like super well known. And something like Radiohead for me, because I grew up in the middle of Ohio,
Mm-hmm.
people didn't even know who Radiohead was really.
Right.
Like an artist like Radiohead was pretty much the same to me as like an artist like, you know, someone a lot more obscure than that, because
Right.
no one had heard of it. And the idea, I think I had this idea that, you know, out in the greater world that, you know, these things would be really popular and that they were somehow on their own level and appreciated. And I think it's weird, like when you actually get out of your own sort of head, you realize like how many sort of weird hierarchies there are between these things. And I don't know, for me, I know it's just reality, but for me it's also kind of disheartening because at some level, like as artists, people really are all on the same level with each other. There's no reason, it's like circumstance that like a band like Radiohead is you know, super popular, but you know, another artist isn't. And like I'm sure skill and, you know, doing something interesting and is involved in some level, but increasingly it feels like it's just a matter of luck and circumstance. So the idea that people are on different hierarchies from each other, and that like people are just so interested in fucking celebrity, and if somebody is well known, like that just doesn't make sense to me. And maybe it's
Yeah.
just because how I grew up. I don't know. Maybe you feel the same way because you grew up with punk.
Yeah. It's interesting to me. I'm actually at work on a book proposal that I've been working on forever. But I swear to you, my God, it will get done. Um, but the book proposal is on the interaction of independent rock music of the underground with the mainstream from the 60s to the present. Um, because there has always been an underground, there's always been a mainstream, and they've always been in core conflict and also co-optation. Um, And that is really fascinating to me. The longstanding dialogue there, where some people use underground music as a ladder to mainstream success. And they start out there because they don't have the requisite connections. So you sort of vault immediately into larger visibility. Some people start there because they like the community that goes along with it, or there's no place for the style of music that they're doing outside of the underground. And it's just really fascinating watching that dialogue happen. I remember seeing Nirvana the summer before my freshman year of or not my freshman year of high school, my first year of middle school, and seventh grade, and I didn't know who they were. It was just like I would go to any show at the 9:30, or in several other clubs. Like I would just go to any show that there was, and I didn't know who they were. It was just like a night that I happened to be able to go out that summer. And I'm like, 12 years old or I was just like, this band's pretty cool. I like it, whatever. Like, didn't really think about it. Bought a tape. It was just like, it was just another band. And then I got back to school in the fall, and like all of like Smells Like Teen Spirit had started blowing up that October, and it was really bizarre to watch frat dudes, future frat dudes, latch onto this band that I had seen in a grubby little club that I wasn't supposed to be in, a few months before. And I think that is where my fascination with this long-standing dialogue comes in. I'm always interested in what outsider sounds end up making it to the mainstream. Is there a limit on how weird you can be? How does the underground push back? Because it always does. And they're always like, well, if the mainstream wants bands that sound like this, we're going to do something that sounds totally fucking different. And then the constant tension between people who really want to make it in the mainstream world, and people who want to stay in the underground for any number of reasons. So all of that is just like utterly fascinating to me.
Yeah, I guess the equivalent for me is Minecraft,
Mm-hmm.
because I didn't know about Minecraft until it started to get big, but I read the first thread on this indie game message board called Tig Source, and
Mm-hmm.
some people that I know were like some of the first people to reply to it, and it's just like any other game, whatever. And then and like I know the I've met the musician for Minecraft like a few times, and we've exchanged links to each other's stuff and whatever, but the only reason I mention that is for Christmas this year, I went to my one of my roommates, lives in town, and his family lives in town, and so went to one of his relatives' house for Christmas, and there were a bunch of kids there, and all the kids got Minecraft related toys. Like every single one of them got Minecraft related toys, and I was
Mm-hmm.
just like, I mean,
So wild.
I know, yeah, and I know that Minecraft has been around for a while, but just seeing that process, because it that's like a one in a million thing, like Nirvana or Minecraft or something like
Right.
that. That's but
I mean, you don't know or expect it either. Like I have had people sort of try to retcon me into being like, well, was it like fucking amazing? And I was like, it was good. I don't know. It was just a band. It was like a rock band with some dudes, and I thought it was cool and it was loud, and I was 12 and didn't know who they were. Like also kind of was it wasn't like this sort of like world-changing thing that happened around me, and I think people are really disappointed by that.
the fact that people perceive that as being world changing, I think is part of the problem
Right.
because
Right.
like I mean there is something amazing to the idea that something that starts very small can become very big, obviously,
Right.
but like I think it kind of takes away from the fundamental thing that like this is part of a culture or landscape where there are a lot of other things like this,
Mm-hmm.
and
Right.
it's not necessarily better than any of the other things out there. It just happened to hit the right notes, you know.
Right.
And
At the right time. And
and yeah,
exactly.
like I mean, if you look at what happened with Kurt Cobain, or you look at what
Yeah.
what's happened to Notch, even like who
Right.
made, you know, like I mean, he has a lot of money, but he's totally become a belligerent, borderline sociopath. Uh,
Right.
um, like that kind of stuff really destroys people too. So like I think because like as a culture we sort of worship those moments because they seem so larger than life, it kind of distracts from the fact, and like we're so interested in that. We're interested, and I feel like the landscape, to go back to talking about, I feel like the landscape of music based around sort of coolness and being there is kind of around that. Like it's like I knew before everyone else that this thing was going to be cool and popular,
Right.
but it's not so much about like supporting like underground art communities of underground artists. It's like you had a jump on the scoop, like you were part of it's
Right.
there. It's a very
Right.
sort of, it's still a very sort of like capitalist mindset that you're buying into
Right.
when you're,
Exactly.
yeah, when you're doing the I was there crap.
Right. Like cultural currency. It's all about like I knew about this thing before you did, and so I'm way cooler than you are. And so I have social capital. Um, and
and
people buy it.
yeah, it seems very, very deeply permeated into music writing, like especially, I mean, during the 2000s, you know, because of the internet, there was a lot more interest in artists from the past who maybe were less well known, but now had become well known, you know, like
Hmm.
um, a lot of like 80s, like Our Band Could Be Your Life, that
Right.
book, or
Right.
like, you know, talk about the Velvet Underground, which I mean, you know, they've always been kind of popular in that sphere, but like becoming more well known and more mainstream
Right.
recognized. And it just it seems like it was like mining those past culture for those moments of like being
Hmm.
like, oh well, this artist is big now, so you see I was there before, and you know, like it's just it's very strange. And
Yeah.
I don't know, like it's upsetting to me because I think about when the lead singer for the band Suicide died
Yeah.
last year.
Vega.
Yeah, Alan Vega. The other guy from Suicide was talking about like, well, I wish we could have gotten this sort of recognition, you know, in our life, or especially when we were doing stuff, because they were saying that like there was so much hostility
Hmm.
in the punk scene, not
Oh
just
yeah,
like
totally.
to what they were doing, and like they even got like interviewed by like, you know, like that big punk book by Legs McNeil, and they like got cut out. They just totally cut out of those interviews, and like, you know, erased from history because they didn't fit whatever narrative.
Mhm.
And it's like easy to go back in time and sort of be like, oh, these things were okay because, you know, this artist that a lot of people didn't know about or hated, now people suddenly like them. But
Right.
it's like there's an element of that's like not okay. Like why does it have to take 30 years, you know, for this
Right.
artist to get recognized, and of being erased not only by outside culture, but of people even within that subculture who don't like it or don't think it's part of like whatever image or whatever, you know, that they
Mhm.
want to project of it.
Right. Right. And there's also like, I mean, that punk has its micro trends as everyone does. Um, and like watching people sort of jump on different bandwagons is really interesting to me. Um, Sometimes it's just out of like you hear a band doing a thing and you're like, I want to do that thing too. So like then you're like, I want to make a thing that sounds kind of like this. But just because you enjoy it. But mostly it's because of a more cynical, everybody's doing this thing, and so this is the only thing that's going to get my band booked, and it's the only thing that's going to get people to recognize us thing, whether I think that's conscious or not. I think that plays into it. And for punk world to claim that it is less subject to that kind of market trendiness than the outside world is ludicrous.
Yeah, or really any underground scene.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it happens. Yeah, it happens everywhere.
I think because like I think about this like independent game world. I think started out. I mean, there are many different iterations of that, but of the last like 10 years or whatever, it started out, and a lot of those people were like, well, I don't care about making lots of money. And then they made lots of money and like,
Mm-hmm.
and then people who were doing the same thing that they were doing 5 years later were not having the luck that they were having. And like, but I think it's like easy for maybe for people who are involved with punk or whatever, or things like that that have more kind of an image of coolness to be like, well, we're anarchist, we're very anti-corporate, but like this thing like chiptunes or vaporwave or like video game music, that's corporate, but it's like no, it's all the same,
It's all the
in
same.
some way. Like, and
Right.
there are plenty of video game makers who are anti-capitalist, and there are plenty of punk musicians who are like straight up, free, as
Yeah,
capitalist as
free
you can
market
get.
capitalists. Yeah, absolutely. 100%. Just because, and this is actually something I was talking with my friend Chris Strunk, who is a very lovely person, was in town for the ISO's socialism conference this past weekend, and he ended up staying with us Sunday night. And we were talking about how there is a desire to ascribe to punk, um, this again, like sort of a retcon history thing, that like to ascribe to it a particular set of leftist politics that it didn't have. Um, Punk as a primary impulse is just reactionary, and that's why you have like the swastika used in a million different ways in early punk, because like there were some people that were using it as like a fuck you to their parents, and there were some people that were using it as an ode to their parents, and there were some people that were just like, this is a thing that pisses people off, so we're going to use it. And there were some people who were like we're going to repurpose this so like in a specifically like trolling fascist sort of way. And so like, and then there were outright fascists. So
It sounds
like,
so much like vaporwave,
yeah,
so much like vaporwave to me.
yeah, it's the same. It's totally the same thing. It's a reactionary genre. Um, and the desire to sort of ascribe a leftist politics that grew out of that, because that's part of a reactionary impulse, is leftist politics that critique the current system, right? But that's not what all early punks were doing, and that's not what punk as a whole is. And I think that even though to a large degree, being anti-capitalist, being involved in leftist activism, like that is my world, absolutely. But there's nothing endemic about punk as a historical force that is that.
Yeah.
And to mischaracterize all artists within that zone, to sort of paint everybody with this broad brush is really ahistorical and really like you're never going to get a good analysis out of an ahistorical perspective. So
Yeah. Well, and I think maybe that's led to some of the things that are happening in the current era where, people are um, people are aware of some degree of like, there's been a lot of progress made with people recognizing sort of cultural misogyny or
Hmm.
racism and kind of that stuff. And that stuff has seeped into music coverage and it's seeped into media coverage in general. And in ways that are really nice, and people are, able to be a little bit more to go back and like say like, hey, maybe there were, these acts or ideas or artists, that were ignored because, of the color of their skin or because they were women or, because they were queer, etc. Um, but I think the other problem is there's almost like a lack of admitting to larger structural issues, like, and
Right.
having a dialogue about that, and like the dialogue about what purpose really does like music writing or entertainment writing or just general cultural, not even specifically writing, but just general cultural discourse um, have, and like what function does it have.
Right.
And I think that's like also led into the like, I talked about this before, but like that there is that era of like, I was there before everyone else, I'm so cool, like writing, and that's sort of like also what Pitchfork sort of started to make its brand on back in the day.
Right.
Um, and then that sort of changed as people were kind of becoming more aware of critiques of issues of misogyny and racism, and that kind of turned into PopTimISM and some of
Hmm.
that. But like as a reaction, and as a way to reevaluate rock snobbery, then it's good, but also like it only ever seems to be interested in like these like massively successful, massively popular artists, and
Right.
not seem to be willing to take on any criticism of them and like the systems that they're participating in.
Right.
And that's kind of where we're at now, and that has started to like blow up, but it doesn't seem like, I think like it doesn't seem like larger dialogues about some of the reasons why these things keep happening, where there's like one reaction one way and one reaction another way, but
Hmm.
both somehow seem to avoid talking about, some structural problems.
Yeah.
um
Oh, I think
it's
you're
frustrating.
absolutely. It is. It's super frustrating. I think you're absolutely 100% correct in that. And there's something that frustrates me like pretty much 24/7. And in that, you also get the commodification of identities, right? So you get like people who are interested. I have noticed like by far an uptick in uh, writing in like being marketed bands that like because I am like an out gay writer and like very like public about my gender and very public about who I am because it's part of me and part of my life. Um, there are all lots of other aspects to me as well. Um, I have been getting like just deluged with like you need to write about this band because they're also queer. And it's used as a marketing angle. Um, and it's the same thing that happened, you know, in the 90s with like, write about all women artists because all women good. Like you need to support the sisterhood or whatever. Like, no, you don't. Like also we're critics. And I can support somebody doing something in theory and not want to cover them because their music is not my thing at all. Um, and I think I mean, it gets into really, really tricky ground where who you are becomes the sum total of what you have to offer, as opposed to who you are affecting the work that you make because it is a product of who you are and the tools that you have and the resources that you have and your life experiences. Um, and that's much more complex and nobody ever wants to talk about that
Well,
except
and
me.
it happens.
Constantly yelling about it.
I think there are people who want to talk about it. People are just afraid because of how much hostility there is. Like,
Yeah.
I mean, the environment of debating anything online right now is incredibly hostile.
Oh, it's the
Like,
worst. It's the worst.
and it's just gotten worse because of all the Trump shit and everything.
Mm-hmm.
So people's fuses are short, and like a lot of people's brains have just been blown up by by things that have happened. And I think like I mean it happens also within, like, if we're talking about like the queer community, within the queer community, like if you have queer punk bands or whatever, there is probably an enormous amount of pressure to be that one band or that one,
Mm-hmm.
that speaks up for queer issues and does that and is everything, and that often rewards people who are just trying to game the system, as is the case with that Power
That,
Bottom
that's
band.
exactly what I was gonna say. Is like that's how you get power bottom. Like that's it exactly.
And, like, I don't know, like, I'm sure I haven't really listened to their music, so I don't want to make a judgment on that. But there are many queer artists who make really, really interesting things who will never
Oh yeah.
get recognized for it. And the idea that, like, and this isn't just like the music sort of journalism criticism landscape, although that is a major issue, and that's the realm. We're all sort of serving systems where we don't have necessarily a lot of control or wiggle room to actually
Right.
do the right thing, because like within queer communities, like, if you want to get more exposure to issues that queer and trans people are going to, which is really important, obviously,
Mm-hmm.
then there's a lot of pressure within those communities to be that person and do that and talk on all those issues. And if you don't, like, oftentimes it's viewed like you betrayed the community and you're
Mm-hmm.
not, and like if you don't like certain people, if you get on the wrong side of certain people who are very popular, then you're out of that community. You don't
Right.
get to be in there anymore. And they could be really fucked up. They could have done something really fucked up, but it doesn't matter because they're popular,
Right.
and because other people have recognized them as being important or popular. So the thing that they serve for the queer community is more than what you serve, even if they've done all this bad stuff.
Right.
And so
Right.
you're stuck. And so the real tragedy of like Bottom or whatever is not that like some queer artists got fucked over. For me it's more that like it's the people who get stepped on the way. And
Mm-hmm.
like the thing is, like, I know that this happens all the time. Like the thing with the guy from Swans, like where it
Yeah.
came out that like he had raped somebody, and then the news just disappeared,
Right.
and like,
Because it
whereas
just
with
became like he said, she said, and like the stuff around. Also, like this is something that like I know that you and I were talking about when the power bottom stuff went down. Is that like his community is not one that will call him out for it. Um, his community would like much rather shove it under the rug like that. Like I love Swans. I have trouble listening to them now. I don't know if I would. I don't know. Like I have a very complex relationship with them. Um, and I don't. I think it's for everybody to make their own choices about like when an artist that you love aesthetically does something absolutely terrible. It's like up to you as a listener to decide where your own line is there. I think that the current atmosphere is very didactic about like they're fucked up. You should never listen to them, and that's like a very prescriptive thing. Um, I personally have trouble listening to artists who I know have done really fucked up shit, but like I also know that it's a little bit more complex than that.
Yeah, okay. So a dimension that I guess doesn't get talked about a lot with something like Swans is like I do think Swans is like musically interesting, and
Mm-hmm.
something like Power Bottom maybe less so. And I think
Right.
part
Agreed.
of and part of the so it is easier for me to dismiss maybe something that is less musically interesting, and I think part of that is also like that there is a side of that like someone like Michael Gira or Gira, I don't know how you pronounce it, um is able, the guy from Swans, are able to be successful and to be integrated into a scene and do this stuff, and able to be able to have nuance, and because he's kind of he's viewed as the default, which is a white guy in like
Right.
punk music or,
Right.
whatever. Whereas an artist like Powerbottom, the only way that they can sort of get noticed to the degree that they were noticed in the landscape right now as queer artists is by framing themselves in the way that they framed
Right.
themselves.
Totally. But yeah, exactly. And so there's so much more, like when you're the default, like you are allowed so much more universality and wiggle room, and there's a whole lot of like, well, it's just one guy. You're allowed individuality because you are not expected to answer for your community, and be a representative of your community in the same way that marginalized artists are. Um,
I think that's a side of the debate when people will be like, maybe like, well, this just isn't as good as something else, or people will suggest, maybe
yeah,
that like women are not as good at this thing or whatever, which is like obviously untrue, and you can point to examples of women being really good at something,
right.
but I
At
think,
anything.
but I think there is a larger part of the debate which gets ignored, which is like part of the reason why there are less women that maybe are able to realize their vision more fully in this world is because they're not allowed to,
Hmm.
and like, and or not just women obviously, but like, because you're in so much of a prescribed role and there are so many expectations on you, you're not allowed to be this like nuanced individual, and I think
Yeah,
that's like the larger
absolutely.
problem. And there isn't an answer to that. Like you can't say that like, oh, women are strong, or queer people are strong, or trans people are strong, so they're just going to overcome. It's just unfair. That's the
No.
only, like, there's no way to answer to that. There's no way to say that like, you know, if maybe their artwork is less interesting than somebody who's had a time to develop their full career and like time to think about these issues in the abstract, and
Hmm.
like, but that's because they haven't had the time. They haven't had the culture that has encouraged them. And this is the other thing that I think like a lot of people don't understand too, is that like nobody makes something in a bubble. Like you are always
Right.
affected by forces around you. Even artists that people think of as being people who hold up, in their house, and like, even like James Joyce or somebody,
Yeah,
you know,
nobody's apolitical. There's no way to be. Like,
what
there's no way to not have context.
Yeah, yeah. Well, exactly. I mean, if you look at, and like I was saying, like, people who are viewed as like iconoclasts, or people who are like, the people who hold up, and like they existed within the culture of their time. Like even someone like David Lynch, like thinking about the new Twin Peaks and all that, like were able to be successful because they knew the right people who were interested in like experimental film and like interested in that kind of stuff, or like someone like James Joyce was around in a time where there are a lot of people doing experiments
Hmm.
with fiction and novels, and a lot of people interested in reading that. So you're always making things for an audience, and
Always.
when that audience isn't there, it's a lot harder. You can't just, like, and that's the reason why there are also artists in the past, who make one really interesting album then disappear.
Right. Right.
Because they don't have the sustained, like, if you don't have anyone who's gonna listen to it, then,
Right. You
you
need,
know,
right. You need both support and feedback. There needs to be like you as an artist exist in dialogue with your audience. Like there is no artist without an audience.
yeah. Well, and I don't know, that's where criticism becomes so important. And I know, like, I think, like, um, I've said this before again, but I've noticed in like the world of video game stuff, the video game journalism and game developers and stuff are a little bit more intertwined, especially if you're talking about like independent games, which sort of led to some of the ideas that reactionary people had about video games, where game developers were supposedly sleeping with journalists to get
Right.
coverage and all that crap. But like, um, in music, it seems often pretty separate, like a critic and an artist. Like you can't really be both.
You can. I am. I make music and I also write about it. And I think that that's something that I run into like kind of often is this idea of like objective criticism, which is extremely silly to me. Of course, like you can't be like people have told me like you can't be an artist and a critic. You can't make music and also write about it, but you can. And being steeped in it and knowing things like knowing how like different creative processes work and thinking about like the functioning of different instruments and different songs and whatnot is different when you are a musician yourself. And I feel like that's aided me in being able to write accurately and thoughtfully about music. I think it's been a real boon for me. Where it gets complicated is when you start talking about, again, friendships and relationships.
Yeah, that's always the big problem. I've got with like in video game land, I've gotten into a lot of trouble for that, and I think I probably messed up some friendships because of that. You know.
Yeah. I mean, it's a hard line to walk. I mean, my line is if like I am friends with, because I'm friends with a lot of other musicians, some of whom are covered on sites that I write for, but I will never, ever, ever be involved with any of that coverage. Like, I won't assign it. I won't talk it. Like, you know, like I need somebody else to handle this completely. Like,
Yeah,
because I'm
I
not
guess.
touching at all. I can put people on to like, hey, there's this record by my friend. It's really good. And they can do with it what they want, you know?
Yeah.
But beyond that, like, I just won't touch it because I don't feel comfortable. And I would never, ever, ever write a piece on something. I have gone on to become friends with people that I have written pieces on.
Absolutely. Yeah.
But in the initial writing, like I would never, ever do that. It just
Yeah.
blurs the lines too much, and you can't. It's not even that you can't be objective about it because I don't think objective criticism exists. Like it comes out of you as a human being
Yeah.
and your experiences and prejudice
Well,
ideas.
I think a person can be more cued into the core of something than
Right.
other people, certainly.
Right, definitely. But I think that to have that context, to bring that context to the table of this person being somebody that you have a relationship with, that you have affection for, it's good. Like whether you think it does or not, it's going to affect the way that you listen to the record.
Yeah. I think it's hard because being in the video game world, it's a little bit smaller than in music where there are so many bands and so many artists out there
Right.
because like if you go to like one big game conference, you can meet a very large swath of people who are releasing stuff.
Right.
So you can know like a very large amount of people who are making things that are actually really good. Um, and that can be a really big problem because if
Yeah.
you go to enough events and meet enough people, then then you can't even cover things because it's like half the things that are coming out are by people that you've met or had a conversation with. But
Right.
anyway,
I try
so
not to. My personal line is like, if I have met the person, that's fine. I'll cover it. If we've just had like a very surface level conversation, fine.
yeah,
But if like I would hang out with that person independently, if we have like text conversations and
yeah.
like genuine emotional sharing things about your lives, like an actual friendship, then no.
Yeah, that's a good line to draw, I think.
Yeah, totally.
Because there are definitely fewer people who I would categorize having that relationship with. But yeah, so I guess one thing that I wanted to talk about a little bit was where where the fuck do you think music journalism, music writing, and some of this stuff is going? Because there was the recent news about MTV News,
Mhm.
and a lot of writers who were good writers
Mhm.
got fired. and by, the MTV News, just as a little background, was like a division of MTV. And it's, I think it was run by people who used to write for Grantland, which
Mm-hmm.
was like an offshoot of ESPN, which is more sort of in-depth, nuanced, critical pieces
Right.
about culture or whatever.
Yeah, Dan
But
Fireman, who was I think he was the editor. I do not know correctly what his title was, but he was sort of the editor-in-chief of MTV News, I believe. Uh,
yeah,
and
well, and
he had been at Grantland.
yes. Well, and a lot of stuff came out recently that, they were sort of hamstrung by being able to write anything like super critical because of the fact that it was coming from MTV. And like there was one example of a guy who had written an article that was mildly critical of Chance the Rapper,
Like
which
barely, like in the most like benign way that one can ever even be possibly critical. Like it was just like, I don't know, there's some parts of this that don't really hit me.
and, and then Chance was like, I'm never working with MTV ever again. Um,
Unless you pull this piece, and they did.
yeah, unless they pulled the piece, and yeah, exactly.
Which is
So
very
I
funny to
guess
me.
that comes up against sort of the compromises of like the music press,
Mhm.
and just press writing about culture and entertainment in general, is like having a sustainable website, having a sustainable like way to make content online, where you're not sort of subject to these very corporate forces and powers that be and things that are beyond your will that limit your ability to actually be critical and evaluate the culture from any kind of uh, I won't say objective, but maybe like nuanced critical view, is severely limited
Mhm.
and increasingly limited. I mentioned this to you earlier too. Like I read a website, UK-based website called the Quietus a
Mhm.
lot, and like constantly they post about how they're not making any money through ad revenue, and they're not sure if they can continue, and like they need to get donations to stay afloat. And like this is a reality for many many websites out
Yeah.
there.
And the Quietus is like they've been doing like really, really in-depth work for a really long time. I really admire a lot of the stuff that they do.
Yeah, absolutely. And they will cover, like, I mean, one of the reasons that I like them is they will cover things that other,
Hmm.
music websites won't. Um, but and like so what do you what happens to this,
Right.
like this, like, does it just disappear, like, and I think the problem is, like, I've noticed this atmosphere, where I can't remember if we were talking about this before I started recording, but like it seems like people are very unwilling to ruin potential opportunities or
Yep.
relationships by being too critical. But then it creates a thing where like the amount of opportunities that anyone has are really dwindling anyway, and it's not like you get paid very much to write for a lot of places, because they just don't have the money or they just don't pay their writers that much, especially freelance. And so you have dwindling opportunities, but but people are willing to kind of hold on to that, with the be and not be too critical, just so that they can hold on to whatever is left. And it just seems like something has to give at some point,
Oh,
and I don't
totally.
know.
No, I mean, we're in a very, very dark place, and especially thinking about net neutrality and how that's going to affect things. Like if what they're trying to pass passes, then the entire world goes upside down for all of us. Um, and obviously the people who have the most money will be the people who are able to access the internet and have their sites accessed um, more, more frequently. And so that, on top of everything that's already going on, is like the trend in our current society towards greater conglomeration, and the more wealthy owning more of the world, and the rest of us owning so much less. The gap gets bigger every day. It's terrifying. It's absolutely terrifying.
Well, there's so much like underground culture and things that you can find on the internet, and like things have been really unequal for a while, for a long time
Hmm.
really, on the internet,
Yeah, absolutely.
yeah, a long time in internet years anyway.
Like the last 10 to 15 years, I would say.
Yeah, and like and already, people doing things on the underground are sort of relegated to the corners
Hmm.
of social media and all this stuff. But increasingly, especially because of recent news, which I won't say exactly what it is, um, more and more culture is disappearing
Hmm.
and is in danger of disappearing. I'm worried about Tumblr also. Like, I
Yeah,
don't know
me
what's going to
too.
happen with that. Um,
Do you know how
and
many like younger music writers I know who came out of Tumblr? Like so many of them did. So many like super talented writers who were able to get picked up, um, who are probably like 10 to 15 years younger than me. Like that was their primary platform, and that's where they started writing, and where like us dinosaurs finally saw it. Like, that's
so
very
many,
scary to me.
yeah, so many visual artists,
Hmm.
who have gotten interest for their work, been able to survive and like get noticed and get people to buy their prints and all that kind of
Hmm.
stuff. So much culture, just not just on Tumblr, but just on a lot of these very precarious platforms,
Right.
that is in danger of immediately disappearing, and that isn't necessarily going to be able to go anywhere else. And like, what do you do? And I don't know. Like, I feel like I feel like some of the response that I just see to people is like this kind of resigned, uh like laughter, like, ha, that place sucked anyway. And it's like, what the fuck is your problem?
Right.
Like,
Right. Like we need to focus on preserving as many outlets to self-publishing as there possibly can be, right? Because like that's how underground culture survives, is self-publishing.
and it's so important that it survives, because like if there isn't, if it doesn't have the ability to exist online, where does it have the ability to exist?
Right.
Like,
Right, because our entire world is online now. Our entire world is, and that's how business is conducted, and that's where you find your audience. And again, like we were talking about, art is nothing without an audience. So how do you find the will and resources to construct your art if nobody is able to listen to it or look at it or, you know, or purchase it? Like it's very scary. And I like the online marketplaces where we live right now. I'm so scared.
yeah, I'm sorry. I just like, a lot of people may not think that this stuff affects them, but it totally does, especially anyone who, makes their living doing things off the internet to any degree.
Yeah.
And who are not, incredibly successful, which is most of
Most
us.
of us, yeah. It's and it's interesting too, like I back in the days when the music industry, when there was still sort of a label industry and an independent label was a thing that you could run, um, and count on people buying your product in some sort of, be it LP or CD. But the aggregation of all of that onto streaming services has made life so much less viable for independent labels as well as musicians. Um, People might be able to access it, but like, how do you find it? That article, I don't know if you read the article that Liz Pelly wrote for Watt on how Spotify playlists work, but it's incredible. She did some really, really good reporting on that. And the basically the content farms who are hired to construct those playlists, and how people with money can pay to get on them and whatnot. Like, there's a whole system to game, and of course it privileges people who have money and resources. And you don't get paid for streams. You get paid, pennies on the literal, like half pennies on the stream.
Yeah, literal. You should link me that article so I can post it in the description
Cool.
for this.
I will. It's so good. And yeah, so there's there's like all of that going on too. So labels don't have money to support artists anymore because they're just trying to eke by. Artists don't have any money, but like there's no structure anymore to support us because people don't buy physical merch at the rate that they used to because of streaming services.
They do pay to go to shows, but I
Yeah,
guess, if you don't have the resources to be able to book the right venues or to have,
right,
an audience that knows about you, it's kind of difficult to do that.
right, exactly. In order to get booked at the venues, I mean, like I can't even count the number of. There always will be, and always like, God bless it, like there will always be a vibrant house show community in punk world, and it's great, and I love it. But you often get paid barely enough to make it to the next town in gas money. You certainly can't make a living that way, and so in order to book the venues that are going to pay you enough that you can actually like make a living off of what you're doing, you need to have gatekeepers because there's no way for people to. It's especially if self-publishing goes away, especially if we lose access to self-publishing platforms. There's no way to build an audience. It's gonna depend on people who folks already know about, and people who are generating buzz through access to, say, having a PR person or a manager or being on like a pretty large visible label. And the number of those are dwindling. So
Well, yeah, and like you also have people who are maybe who do have success, but maybe not, you know, um, like superstars or whatever, who like maybe aren't sort of willing to acknowledge the way that or talk about the ways that these how difficult it is for anyone else trying to get started with no resources now. Like I was thinking about, somebody mentioned this, the Anoni um, wrote a really good piece about sort of the sacrifices you have to make as an artist working with streaming platforms, and it was a good piece. And there were a lot of good points made, or I think it was an interview, but somebody made the point that like, well, her album, she might not be like Frank Ocean or whatever,
right,
but like her album got a lot of praise, and
right,
for being relatively challenging, it got a lot of attention,
right.
a lot of people, and a lot of respect. And um, she isn't really aware of how even more difficult it is for anyone trying to like get
Mhm.
started now. And I feel like
Right.
there's
Because
that kind of,
she started like back in the days when there was like kind of a robust music industry.
yeah. Um, I don't know. So like the venues for even having these discussions seem difficult because they seem so um, like there's nowhere that this discourse is able to happen outside of people being upset on Twitter or something.
Yep. Yeah. And that, of course, is limited in many ways by the functionality of the platform itself. Um, man,
I
I'm so
oh
depressed.
so so let's spent the last like 15 minutes or so talking about maybe some of the positive things that can be done about this.
Yeah. Really, man, thinking about mean, really just like getting behind artists who are doing, I mean, there are things like Kickstarter and Patreon and whatnot for supporting artists who you believe in. And I hate that that's pretty much our future, but it is. It's just,
It's my life. I'm supported through Patreon. That's
yeah.
how I pay my bills. I signed up for thank you Patreon supporters for listening to this podcast. I I kind of I think I started at the right time. I started right when Patreon started out, and I was able to get money and support through that. And I'm very blessed, but I do not have nearly as much money on Patreon as a lot of other people. But I'm able to pay my rent,
That's amazing.
um, which is, yeah, amazing when you think about how the landscape is for a lot of other people.
Yeah.
There are a lot of issues with it. It is a better alternative to a lot of other things, but it's not
No, it's not
necessarily a
perfect.
good one.
No, no, it's not. I mean, until we overturn capitalism, everything's gonna suck. Um, and until then, we just have to make do with the tools that we have, and keep in mind all of the flaws that they have as well. Like, they're certainly not a perfect system, but supporting artists through their own websites, through Bandcamp, through Kickstarter, through Patreon, like those, through, whatever self-publishing platforms, and ways to give them dollars that they have, going to their shows, especially if they're smaller bands, and supporting them that way. I think that's how this stuff is going to survive. It's going to be through direct artist to audience connection, and people being willing to look outside of what they're, it's going to involve like curiosity. And that's hard to foster, but I think it's really important to foster that in people is a sense of adventurous listening, adventurous viewing, thinking about how even if you're not necessarily comfortable with something that, say, is just like, it seems a little too weird to you. It seems a little too out there. You don't quite understand it. But giving it a chance, that sort of like human adventurousness and curiousness and willingness to sort of dig into the world and not just support artists who are part of this like big star system.
Yeah,
Like, it's going
I
to
think,
depend on that too, you know?
yeah. Well, and I think we live in an era where people treat content as disposable because
Yeah,
there is a lot of disposable content out there,
there
but
is.
something that is kind of more unique or different or, work through, there's something very sensitive to that, and there's something very fragile
Hmm.
about it. Like, that kind of thing can go away very easily, and it can not necessarily come back. So just depending on the idea that these things and these aspects of culture will exist just because, we think that people will just continue to make something because we have content platforms or whatever. That's not true at all.
Right.
Like, this stuff can go away very quickly. Um, and yeah, I don't know. I think it's so easy just because we're in this place where we're so blinded by content.
Hmm.
A lot of which is disposable, but then there's stuff that is not,
It's
and
fascinating too how much disposable content larger platforms churn out, um,
yeah.
because they are dependent on clicks for money, right? Um, so that's become like the nature of the game. Whereas like smaller platforms, I mean, we do um, 5 features a day, 1 review, and 4 interviews or lists, or um, and our lists are not like listicles. It's not the same thing. But 4 interviews or lists or features a day, and that is an enormous undertaking for a team as small as ours is. But it's hard to struggle against that, even to sort of like get people to pay attention to what you're doing in this like endless content flood, because bigger platforms that have a lot of resources are sort of like out there putting out 100 gazillion articles a day, like throwaway shit, because they
Putting
need the click.
putting out video content that no one watches.
Yeah, God, the fucking that's the thing about the MTV News thing. If you guys don't know, that we didn't mention is that everybody got fired because the site pivoted to video.
Not because there's more like reads or clicks on videos or there's more interest in it, but because it's easier to advertise
Right.
on video.
Right. It's easier to monetize. It's easier to get advertisers interested in.
Yeah, exactly.
Right. And that, like, there was the whole argument that, like, oh, people aren't reading, like, these 2,000 word stories or whatever, but people were reading. And people do read. As somebody who publishes stories of that length, if you do really quality work, like, people absolutely will read it. But it is hard to even get them to click on it in the first place, because they're just like, I've read like 1,700 articles today, and like all of them were like most of them were just like useless throwaway articles. Or I've noticed a rise in advertorial lately that is really, really pissing me off. It's all over my Facebook feed, which is really interesting. Almost every, like, if I see a sponsored post from like a site that I don't usually read, it's almost always advertorial, which I think is really interesting.
That is pretty depressing.
Yeah.
I think like in some ways you guys at Bandcamp are pretty lucky, because Bandcamp, is able to sustain itself through being a content platform.
Yep.
And
We're super
which
lucky.
means you have a lot of more leeway, and there's a lot of culture and stuff that's happening on Bandcamp, so you have a lot more leeway to cover this stuff.
Yeah. We have endless amounts of music to cover, and some of it is bad and some of it is good, but a lot of it is good. Like,
I mean, I will say, like, I've read a few of, probably 3 or 4 of the, like, here's a massive amount of different artists. Here's like a little bio of them. Like, I read one about artists of color in Oakland.
Yeah.
Because I used to live in Oakland and I wanted to know about that. Yeah. And like, I'm always worried when I click on these things that it's going to be, the kind of power bottom situation. Right. But it wasn't. It wasn't. I actually really liked a lot of the artists in that.
That article was awesome. When the writer brought me that article, I was also very wary of it. But the more she talked about the individual artists and the fact that, like, they're all connected to each other. It wasn't just like, here's just some random artists of color that we like threw together. It was like a scene of people who all know and support each other.
Yeah, I actually have met one of the people who was in that article. She used to be roommates with somebody that I know.
That's awesome. But I loved every artist in the article. Like, I listened to all of their records and I was like, this is legitimately really good music, and it's challenging music and it's interesting music, and I want people to be able to hear this.
Yeah, I think that's the good point, that it's challenging and interesting music. Like, it's something different too. Like, I really liked the article about experimental Japanese artists too, because I mean, I got into some of them through Orange Milk Records, and
you did a good profile on Orange Milk Rules.
Yeah, and like it's not just that these artists are out there or that they're good, it's that they're doing something different too, and they're doing something that like a lot of people don't know about, and it's actually worth, like, it's not just like another thing that's pretty good, or even like good, just from this like default level of like, good indie rock band that's good at writing songs or whatever. It's like actually something different, that's the kind of stuff that changes culture and adds, and like, and that's what people should know about. And so I'm really happy that you guys are doing that stuff, but I really don't know if that has the ability to exist on, because like Bandcamp at the end of the day is much more benign than a lot of other content platforms.
Yes.
And I don't know if like a lot of other content platforms, if the future is like content platforms hiring people to write about stuff, then obviously...
The thing about us is that we have such a wide variety of music in so many different corners, and a lot of it is really challenging and interesting, and people are doing something experimental and different. We have the luxury of like having a lot of that stuff to cover and not being forced to cover the same like 5 artists that everybody else is. But if you are a huge content platform that depends on major label artists who are part of that star system, like you're going to find your venues controlled by that, and you're not going to be able to like deal with criticism in the same way that we do. It's a challenge every day to sort of whittle down the immense amount of things that we could cover. I am booked out currently. My current editorial calendar is booked out into September right now.
Wow.
Which is insane because like we have that much stuff to cover. And there's so much incredible music out there, and there's stuff that gets missed, and there's stuff that doesn't get covered that I think is really cool sometimes.
Like if the future can't just be content platforms
Right.
writing about stuff.
Yeah.
Although like, you know, if some do as good of a job of Bandcamp and they have the amount of artists
Yeah.
putting stuff out, then there's potential for, you know, doing really interesting work there. But obviously there also need to be independent publications
Right.
and like a Patreon and stuff. I think it's doable. I think people like want that to some degree, but I don't know exactly how you find that audience. You have to let people to be able to express their discontent openly and be able to talk about these things openly, and like
Right.
I don't know. I think part of my worries are that like, you know, some like reactionary kind of 4chan sort of culture will become bigger or more, you know,
Mhm.
which maybe I'm like, I don't know. It's not
I mean, we have it
just
in the
because,
White House right now.
yeah.
So I don't think that's an
Yeah.
unfounded fear.
Yeah, exactly.
Oh God.
Well, especially in where there's like a vacuum of things that are genuinely sort of critical or challenging because people are so hamstrung by the economy, or like they don't want to the economy of these things, or they don't want to like ruin potential relationships, that they just don't say things, and then, you know, a reactionary sort of group ends up taking over, and like that happens. Like I watched that happened in video games, you
Right.
know, like
Right.
I mean like it's a little bit different, but yeah, but like that's essentially what happened. And like so these things are real, like actual threats and problems, and it's not just that like, you know, if this stuff disappears, something, it's not necessary that it's anything, nothing might replace it, and nothing good might replace it. So
Right.
like that's why it's important to like honestly, like there's less to lose now by just saying stuff and just saying it openly and being like, hey, like let's actually try and fight this and do something different, because if you don't, then maybe nothing will happen, or maybe something even worse will happen, and like all this culture goes away, all these things go away because people are afraid
Right.
to say anything about it.
I mean, ultimately, I mean, there are things there like content platforms publishing stuff like we're doing as a stopgap. Patreon is a stopgap. Um, the building of new independent institutions is going to be the future if we are to survive. How we do that is it often seems like an insurmountable challenge, but if we don't try, like we're never going to, you know, like we have to be able to at least try to build them. We have to believe that they are possible. Um,
Yeah,
we
well, I
need
think
them.
they're
We need
they're
them.
if we're having if we're having this conversation right now, I feel like it's possible, you
Right.
know,
No.
even if like I mean I'm probably like only gonna have like 100, 200 people listen to this. That's still something. I guess that's a start, you know. That's something.
Yeah. I mean, I am buoyed right now by the fact that um, I am. I mean, I love my dog also, but like outside of that, I've been working for the last 4 years on trying to open an all-ages venue in Chicago, because there is none. There is absolutely no place for young kids to play. And if there's no place for like young kids to play and see outsider music, like outsider music dies, right? It was integral to me to have a place to have that, because I was so young when I entered punk world, because my parents gave me the opportunity to do that. That set out my life path for me in some ways, and I feel very lucky to have had that. If like kids need a place, and right now it's so much harder. Like you can't just walk into a record store anymore and pick up a flyer for a house show, because you can't publish house show addresses anymore because cops will come shut them down.
Also, like, with like things like the ghost ship fire
Right.
happening, there are more
Right.
sort of more and more restrictions on that.
Right.
And
Totally.
venues like can't be all ages because they depend upon alcohol
Right.
sales.
Exactly. So the only way for us to structure something like that was to do it as a nonprofit, above ground art and music community center. And it has taken us 4 years to find a space, because commercial real estate does not want to rent to a just getting off the ground nonprofit art space that is specifically geared towards like teens and young adults. It's been hard convincing landlords, like people like that live music and experimental live music in particular, and participating in live music, being part of the audience as well as being somebody who makes music, is a public good. I believe that it is a public good. Without it, culture dies. So, um, so it's taken us a very long time to find a space, but we are at the point where we are in lease negotiations on a space. I don't know if it's going to work. I don't have, it's not a done deal yet, but we're further than we've ever gotten. Just out of sheer luck and like determination. We've seen hundreds of spaces. I think we've submitted applications on like 33 of them or something like that. But
Wow.
this has taken 4 years for us to do, and we just never gave up. And hopefully this one works out. If not, it's back to the drawing board. We'll see what happens.
Mm-hmm.
But like, you have to just keep going, right? Like, if you really,
What else is there to do
what
anyway?
else is there to do? But like, keep looking at spaces and keep talking to landlords and whatnot. Because like, the space needs to exist. I believe in it. I know that it needs to exist.
Yeah. Well, I wish you the best. I think like
Thank
you're
you.
talking about it being a public good. Like if we have, if we ever actually have like more left-wing leadership
Mm-hmm.
in this country, hopefully that becomes. I feel like that should become a central point for artists
Yes.
to talk about how
Yes.
we need that sort of culture, and we need it to be treated as a public good and not just like a commercial space,
From the local level
because
on
it
up.
is so important. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's important yeah, it's so important for communities. It's important for actually getting people into the same space as each other and like
Mhm.
talking about things, and cuz like our culture right now, it's very isolated. People don't, I mean, I don't really know my neighbors or talk to them, and that's pretty much the same with a lot of, most people. So, yeah,
Yeah, I only
well, I
know my
guess,
neighbors because I've lived in the same place for a while now. But most people don't. It's, yeah,
yeah.
like, and I should mention on the local leftist government tip that part of the reason that this particular space is so welcoming to us is because it is the only ward in the city of Chicago where the alderman has made arts funding, has earmarked local funding for arts and music. The only ward in the city.
Wow.
So the alderman of that particular ward is totally behind us, and without his support, I don't know if we could do that.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if the landlord would be as open to talking to us.
Well,
so that's why it's super, super important to, man, I am always the biggest yeller about local elections, and
mm-hmm.
and about how everybody's engaged with politics right now because we can't not be, because we are in a legit dystopic state of emergency. But once this passes, if we all don't get blown up or zapped by, I don't know,
or poisoned by lead poisoning,
or poisoned by our water, or we run out of water, or it becomes too hot to function, which is what I meant by zapped, zapped by the environment.
Yeah.
If that doesn't happen first, I worry about people not engaging with their local government, because it's, you've got a million things to think about, and being engaged on a very local level is hard to do. And it's also, it gets a whole lot less coverage, and it's not as glamorous. But man, if we are going to affect any change in our culture, it's got to start there.
It's also, at the end of the day, it is a lot better and easier to talk to people in person than it is to talk to them online, because online is a space where it's I mean, I have Facebook friends who immediately blow up on each other, even more so than in the past now, and that's just we're in the era of angry online discourse because everyone is freaked out and upset. So that's why it's even more important to feel like a human being, to have conversations. I mean, I make an effort.
Go to your neighborhood meetings. Go to your neighborhood association meetings. Go to your tenant meetings. Go see your local councilman or alderman or whatever. If you have a concern about how shit is going in your world, these are the things that affect us on a daily basis.
Of course, I'm a total hypocrite on this because I don't do those things.
I guess I was way more focused on sort of get out in the streets activism, which is a lot more glamorous.
That's true. I saw. I mean, one thing that you can do even online is just don't talk to people on public platforms, message them privately, talk to them on the phone. I mean, it seems ridiculous that I even have to say that, but it feels like people talk on the phone less and just angrily post on Facebook more. It's totally. It's more worthwhile to actually have a conversation where you can talk to somebody about stuff. And I don't even know why I need to tell people that, but I feel like I need to.
No, because we don't. And I have friends that just don't answer their phones ever. I'm old, so I'm 38. Like, that's not that old in the grand scheme of things, but I grew up, talking to my friends on the telephone in high school and through college and having, those kinds of marathon phone conversations and shit. I really like talking on the phone. And sometimes you just have to have a conversation about something, and you have to hear somebody's voice. And I have friends who will legit not even pick up their phones, and they're my age too, so I don't fucking know.
Yeah, that's just how things are. I don't know. We have to start somewhere, and if it's just talking on the phone, that's better than something else, I suppose.
Yeah. But
it's better than a lot of the options that people are choosing right now.
Yeah, totally. I mean, if you can click on a petition to send it around on the internet somewhere, most of those are incredibly useless. Some of them are more useful than others. The more local and focused the petition, the better. Or if we can pick up the phone to call our congressman's office about healthcare, we can go down the street to our neighborhood association meeting or whatever, it doesn't require that much more energy.
Yeah. Well, I want to thank you so much for coming on. This has been a great
It
conversation.
has. Thank you so much for having this conversation with me. It makes me really happy to talk to you. My brain feels good right now.
Oh, that's excellent. Wow. Yeah, I mean, I'm always like, I feel so privileged to be able to have these conversations, and I hope people get something out of them. Like I said, I just don't feel like there's a lot of venues for this discourse, and
No.
even if only like 100 or 200 people listen to it, it still means something to me. So,
No, seriously, thank you for providing a space where we can have these conversations because they are so incredibly valuable.
well, thank you. Thanks again, Jes Skolnik. They write for Bandcamp. They're associate editor at Bandcamp, also music writer. I'll put your Twitter in the
Yeah,
description.
my Twitter is
And thanks
annoying.
again. No problem. And you can also, I guess I never mentioned that, you can support me on Patreon at patreon.com/ELLAGURO. I'll put it in the
Go
description.
support,
Anyway,
go support independent artists.
yeah, support more independent artists. Absolutely. Support more artists
Support
that you
independent
like.
platforms and independent magazines and independent work. The more institutions we have,
Absolutely.
better.
Okay, well, thank you so much for being on. I appreciate it.
Thank you so much.